We are going to get meta here, as I respond to Cameron Bertuzzi's response to my critique of the wide-angle X-ray scattering dating of the Shroud of Turin on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Okay, last week we did a review of 3 articles that were related to the wide-angle X-ray scattering, waxes, dating of the Shroud of Turin. While none of these articles are new, in the last few weeks they have been publicized as proof that the Shroud of Turin dates to the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Now, in our review, we found systemic methodological problems that gave us reason to doubt the conclusions that the authors of these papers presented. However, on Tuesday, August 7th, 2024, Cameron Bertuzzi decided to respond to our critique. Unfortunately, much of his video obscured or just plainly misrepresented our concerns. So, what we're going to do in this video is go through Bertuzzi's response in order to clarify these issues. We should note that Bertuzzi has a popular YouTube channel with a large following. He is not a scientist or an archaeologist. He has no background in either of these disciplines. As such, he is a lay person when it comes to these fields. And we're going to be kind to him, so we're not going to popcorn him. However, we're not going to shy away from his mistakes either. Now, the video where he responds to us is relatively short, only 15 minutes, but there's a lot in there. So we're just going to take this snippet by snippet to get through the material. Okay, here we go.
Has recent scientific evidence finally unlocked the mystery of the Shroud of Turin? Around the world, Christians are buzzing with excitement over this new scientific evidence that seems to authenticate the Shroud, but...
Okay, some Christians are buzzing. Others have remained more cautious and circumspect. You can be a faithful, believing Christian and be in either camp on this one. I am a Bible-believing Christian. I believe in miracles. And yet I've chosen to be circumspect and cautious about this discovery. We should note, however, that this does seem to be an issue that resonates more with Roman Catholics than it does with other divisions of Christianity.
As expected, this evidence is now coming under fire.
We can't from this conclude that the Shroud of Turin is a 1st century AD artifact. Not from this. This study should not be used. It would be very, very unwise to continue to quote it in support of the Shroud of Turin.
In today's video, we're tackling the strongest criticisms head-on, from claims of flawed methodologies to accusations of scientific bias. We'll be diving deep, and I really do mean deep, into the debate, exposing what the critics might not actually be telling you. I'm Cameron.
Since I am the only critic Bertuzzi has quoted in this video, I resent the accusation that I'm hiding something from the rest of you. It's the, quote, well, the critic has told you some negative information, but they're hiding the real goods, and I'm going to give you the real info, end quote. We've been very upfront about our critiques and why we object to certain kinds of evidence. We have also made pains to make it clear that if you want to believe the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, knock yourself out. That's a faith decision. We don't question faith decisions. But if you want to say a certain scientific paper proves that the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Jesus, that's not a faith decision. That's a truth claim. And truth claims need to be evaluated to see if the evidence warrants those conclusions.
What makes the Shroud of Turin such a focal point of fascination and debate. What exactly is it, and why does it stir such strong reactions? The Shroud of Turin is a centuries-old linen cloth that bears the faint, detailed image of a man who appears to have been crucified. Revered by many as the actual burial cloth of Christ, the shroud has been the subject of intense study and debate. Despite its mysterious origins, this artifact has intrigued scientists and theologians alike, as its image remains unexplained by conventional methods of art and photography.
Okay, the image being unexplained by conventional methods of art and photography. What about unconventional methods of art? Why is it either conventional art or it's a miracle? What frustrates me about this debate is the black and white thinking that surrounds it. Either it's a conventional art piece or it's a miracle. It's either painted with red ochre or the radiance of 10,000 suns created it. It's either 14th century or 1st century. It's either a medieval forgery or it's the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. The problem is there's third options to all these questions. So we need to resist black or white thinking to properly evaluate the shroud as an artifact within its historical context.
In 2022, a team of researchers made headlines with a very bold claim. They used a cutting-edge technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS, to date the shroud.
I so hate this graphic. It misrepresents how wide-angle X-ray scattering works. The technique is an extension of X-ray crystallography. And the way it works is you pass a beam of X-rays through a matrix of material, and imperfections in the material cause the beam to scatter.
Of Turin. Their findings? The shroud could actually be 2,000 years old, potentially placing it in the time of Jesus.
Ooh, not quite, but we'll get to that.
This revelation sent shockwaves through both the religious and scientific communities, but now their critiques are literally pouring in.
Okay, these papers didn't send shockwaves to the scientific and religious communities when the paper was published in April 2022. The paper was largely ignored until a few weeks ago. But that's not a criticism. Important papers often go through fallow periods, where they're ignored when they first come out, only to be appreciated later when their findings are truly understood. However, Bertuzzi's claim that this created a shockwave when the papers came out is just false. And of course, by critiques pouring in, he really means me.
All right, with this background now set, let's shift gears to the present day and focus on one of the most vocal critics of the recent findings, Dr. David Falk. What's his take on this groundbreaking research?
I'm now one of the vocal critics. Look, other academics are not interested in this subject, but this is a truth claim that can affect people's faith. So I think it warrants scrutiny in order to build up the body of believers with a healthy faith. I don't see a problem with scrutinizing truth claims for that reason.
And could he be exposing fatal flaws that others have actually missed? So in their video, Falk and his producer wasted no time ripping into the 2022 study.
Just a correction here. We didn't start our video by ripping into the 2022 study. We started with the 2017 paper and then focused most of the video on the 2019 study, which was foundational for the 2022 study. We actually had a lot more problems with the 2019 study than we did with the 2022 study. However, if the 2019 study has methodological flaws, those flaws would seriously compromise the 2022 study.
They kicked things off by pointing out that only 9 comparison samples were used, a number they argued was far too small to draw any reliable conclusions.
The 9 samples are in the 2019 study, not the 2022 study. The 2022 study only adds 2 additional samples: a second bleached linen sample from 2000 AD, and the Shroud of Turin sample itself.
You should not be drawing strong conclusions from a small sample size.
You shouldn't be drawing conclusions from a small sample size, but I think it gets worse.
They also took issue with the study's lack of blind sampling, accusing the researchers of introducing bias.
So there's no blind sampling here. That's terrible methodology to provide this as a means of say, dating.
And to top it off, Falk raised a major red flag about the 16th century fire that scorched the shroud, suggesting it could have artificially aged the linen fibers and made the results unreliable.
So what I'm hearing you say is they're just dismissing the fire.
They're just dismissing the fire.
It almost sounds like a complete slam dunk case against this study, doesn't it? But things get even worse. Falk goes further, pointing out that some of the same researchers behind the 2022 study were also involved in a controversial 2017 study on the shroud's blood evidence.
It's a terrible paper, and it was retracted.
According to him, this retraction is a serious red flag, hinting at a pattern of overreaching conclusions. So at first glance, Falk's critiques seem pretty damning. It looks like the research has been thoroughly dismantled. But I'm reminded of Proverbs 18:17, which says, "The first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him." As I mentioned, Falk does...
Okay. Well, Cameron, you were actually the first to plead the case. I was the second man. Now you're doing a third pleading. This will be the fourth. This is getting very meta.
Doesn't just critique the 22 study. He reaches back to 2017, bringing up a previous controversy that might cast a shadow over the new findings. So let's explore why this earlier study actually matters and what it means for the credibility of the latest research. Now, Falk's concern here is definitely worth taking seriously. A retraction like this can make us second guess the credibility of the people involved. However, the 2022 WAX study zeroes in on a completely different aspect of the shroud, its age, not on blood evidence. But more importantly,
okay, the 2017 paper covered both blood evidence and the wax's method. That paper was not just about blood evidence. I quote here from the abstract. Quote, "We performed reproducible atomic resolution transmission electron microscopy and wide-angle X-ray scattering microscopy experiments," that's wax, "studying for the first time the nanoscale properties of a pristine fiber taken from the Turin shroud," end quote. Okay, so wax is in the abstract here. And in the 2017 article, they are already using waxes to verify the aging of the fibers long before they had published their 2019 waxes study as a supposedly general purpose dating method. In the 2017 article, in Figure 4, they already had compared the Turin shroud to a 6th century linen sample that would become later known as Sample D. So in 2017, the research team was already using waxes as a dating method long before they had warrant to know if the technique worked. This screams of confirmation bias. They knew the result they wanted before they had the evidence to validate their claims. So while the 2017 paper was retracted based upon the blood evidence, the paper also mentions their early claims with the waxes method.
Importantly, it was actually carried out with much more transparency, clearly incorporating lessons learned from the past. Science evolves, and so does the rigor behind it. The 2022 approach seems far more rigorous.
How is Cameron qualified to make that claim? He's not a scientist, or an archaeologist, or a chronographer. He has no training in any of those fields. Has he even read the 2019 paper? It doesn't appear as though he has read it, because that's where the waxes method is really fleshed out. And the 2022 paper assumes the conclusions from the 2019 paper. So then, what is his basis for saying that the 2022 paper has more rigor? It just does sound like, trust me, bro.
So does the 2017 retraction mean that we should be cautious? Absolutely. It's a good reminder to scrutinize new research carefully, but it doesn't automatically refute the 2022 study. The WA...
And I would agree. the 2017 retraction does not automatically refute the 2022 study. What it does is raises red flags that they were employing confirmation bias in 2017, and they may still be employing confirmation bias in later studies. The 2019 and 2022 studies need to be evaluated on their own merits, and that is what we did.
AXS research should be judged on its own merits. All right, having now addressed the 2017 study, it's time to return to the present and critically evaluate the 2022 research itself. The spotlight here is on the WAXS technique, which is an innovative method that measures how cellulose and linen fibers degrades over time to estimate the shroud's age. What were their results? The degradation that they observed lines up with linen that's about 2,000 years old, potentially placing the shroud right in the time of Christ.
Okay, it doesn't line up with the time of Christ, but about 100 years after. So I'm going to pull up a graph here. This is a graph that the study's authors should have done, but failed to do. I plotted their 9 samples from the 2019 study. On the x-axis, we have the date. On the y-axis, we have the aging factor. And I've included both horizontal and vertical error bars. The vertical error bars were supplied by the study, and the horizontal error bars are based upon their 95% confidence and 2 sigma levels. So plus or minus 100 years. I added the result from the Turin shroud sample marked in blue, and the date of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ with a gold star, and that dates to between AD 30 and 33, or in other words, the early 1st century. Sample F2 is from Masada, and dates to between AD 55 to AD 74. So, since this is Masada, it's more likely to be closer to AD 74, so late 1st century. Now, the result from the TS sample, which is the Turin shroud sample, has an issue. The sample dates to the late 2nd century according to Wax's. Now, they didn't plot this on a graph, and I think the reason is clear. Using this method, nothing can skew a Wax's result so that the sample appears younger than it is. But there are a lot of adverse factors that can make a sample appear older than it is. Thus, the Wax's result is the earliest possible result for the Shroud of Turin, given all the possibilities that could affect the dating. The problem, though, is that the 2022's authors are operating under a kind of black or white fallacy. If they show that the shroud doesn't date to the 14th century, then it must date to the early 1st century. But that's not necessarily the case. The shroud could have undergone some adverse factors that could make the shroud appear 500 years older than it actually is. In which case, the Wax's method shows the date as 8200 plus or minus 100 years. The shroud could actually date as late as the 9th century AD. Moreover, the study's authors are playing games with the error bars. They're saying that the Turin shroud dates to 8200 plus or minus 100 years, and the F2 sample dates to AD 57 to 74 plus or minus 100 years. Therefore, the Turin shroud dates to AD 30 to 33. But no dating works like this. Dating methods are not commutative. I can't take a sample that dates to 81,000 plus or minus 100 years, compare it to a second sample that dates to AD 850 plus or minus 100 years, then claim, because of the overlapping error bars, that the first sample really dates to AD 750. Dating methods don't work like that. Each sample has to stand upon its own measurement. So, the Turin shroud could date to no earlier than the late 1st century AD. But that's half a century too late. And again, the Wax's method shows the oldest possible date for a sample, not the youngest. So the Shroud of Turin could date to hundreds of years later than the late 1st century AD, but not earlier than that.
But before we get too excited, we've got to ask, how solid are these findings when faced with Falk's sharp critiques? So let's dig in. So one of Falk's major critiques centers on the number of samples used in the 2022 study. The
2019 study. That mistake is going to get irritating.
Researchers selected 9 linen samples with known historical ages ranging from the 3rd century BC to the 17th century AD to...
Okay, Cameron clearly didn't read the papers. The 9 samples were not from the 3rd century BC to the 17th century AD. They were from the 4th millennium BC to the 21st century AD. 2 of the 9 samples date to the 21st century AD, around the year 2000. 4 samples are from before 200 BC. This leaves 3 samples that date to their area of interest. Sample D2 is 10th to 12th century, sample D is 6th to 7th century, and sample F2 is late 1st century. I think Cameron needs to stop relying on ChatGPT. It's not doing him a service.
To compare with the Shroud of Turin. These comparison samples were chosen based on their well-documented provenance, historical context, and physical similarities to the shroud, such as material composition and preservation conditions. To determine the age, and this is fascinating, the researchers used wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS, as I've already mentioned, to measure the degradation of cellulose in the linen fibers. This technique allowed them to assess how the cellulose structure had actually naturally aged over time by comparing the degradation patterns of the shroud's fibers to those of 9 known age samples. They were able to estimate the shroud's age. The consistent degradation patterns along all samples provided a basis for dating the shroud to approximately 2,000 years old, aligning it with...
Let's examine that statement. Quote, the consistent degradation across all 9 samples, end quote. In the graph the paper's authors should have produced, but didn't, I plotted a curve in red. I tried to be as generous as I could with this curve. I gave the study's authors every benefit of the doubt, but unfortunately, the data is not going to permit a normal curve. Now, I also want to be clear about this. Sometimes S-curves appear in nature. I have never seen an S-curve from a natural dating method that arches up in a parabola, then flatlines. This is not consistent degradation across all 9 samples. 3 samples show progressive degradation, then a hard flatline. How can one even claim that this is consistent degradation across all 9 samples? I don't get it. There is something really, really wrong with these results. It looks like the section in blue they really cared about shows consistent degradation, and then thought no one would look at the older or younger samples. When you get a graph like this, it usually screams one of 2 things: incompetence or malfeasance. We can tell from this graph that the Wax's method is useless for any sample older than 2,000 years, because all 4 of the samples stretching over 3,000 years have produced the exact same result. But that transition from a steep curve to a flat line makes no sense, not in a dating method like this. Maybe something about the chemistry of flax depletes after 2,000 years. But it would be up to the researchers to show what that was. What we get instead is no comment on that part of the data set at all. This leaves us with open questions. Were the results curated? Did they throw out samples that didn't conform to a curve in their area of interest and just didn't document it? Did the fact that the dates of these samples were known to the researchers influence their results? We do already know that the researchers were susceptible to confirmation bias from their 2017 study. Could that have happened again? And the strange thing is that these scientists never discuss this data anomaly. They are fixated on the Shroud of Turin while overlooking the problems with their method.
With the time of Jesus. And so here's where things get really interesting. So in his video, Falk argues that the 9 comparison samples is basically, it's not a large enough sample size to draw reliable conclusions from. But look, this is the fact of the matter. The researchers weren't just picking random bits of fabric. They chose these 9 samples because they closely match the shroud in terms of age, material, and preservation. So it's not about quantity, it's about quality.
It's about quality, not quantity. Gee, I thought science was about finding reproducible results. This should be the end of the discussion right here. The researchers cherry-picked their data for quality. Waxes is not a general-purpose dating method. It is a one-purpose dating method, and that is to date the Shroud of Turin. This is not science, but this is what confirmation bias looks like. And no, 9 samples are not sufficient to validate a general purpose dating method. Thousands of samples, yes. Less than 10? No. Get real. We have insufficient evidence to know if the method works.
Furthermore, the scientific results utilizing WAXS were uniform across all 9 samples.
No, they weren't. That's a lie. You can see on the graph they weren't uniform. I don't know what he's talking about here. It is clearly not a uniform degradation. I have no idea what he's talking about. It's like he hasn't read the papers.
So, in other words, the results from the WAXS test were the same for all 9 pieces of cloth.
Well, they were the same for the last 4 the samples older than 200 BC. And that's the problem. They were the same. 11.5 all across the board. Yeah, you don't want all your samples to be the same. Maybe the same level of degradation, but not the same. And for those last 4 samples, they were the same. And that's the problem. They were the same, and the researchers did not account for this. We have no reason to rely on this method to produce a reliable result.
Sometimes a smaller, more consistent data set can actually tell you more than a larger, inconsistent one. And
okay, give us a credible example where a data set of less than 10 samples for a general purpose dating method is better than a large data set. This is special pleading. It's just, he doesn't know the field. He doesn't know chronometry. He just doesn't understand what he's talking about.
here's something really interesting, as Dr. Falk would be well aware. In fields like archaeology and conservation science, researchers often draw significant conclusions from studies with even fewer samples. When you're dealing with rare artifacts, sometimes you
Not for chronometric dating. No one claims to have discovered a general-purpose dating method on this few samples. Cameron doesn't know what he's talking about.
don't have the luxury of large data sets, and yet these studies still produce reliable, widely accepted results.
Okay, Cameron is clearly confusing dating of rare artifacts using material from their context with the validation of dating methods itself. Those are apples and oranges. And he clearly doesn't understand the difference.
Success of these studies show that with the right methodology, small sample sizes can absolutely lead to credible findings, especially
with the right methodology, end quote. How does one determine if the methodology is right? By validation using a large data set and blind testing. And therein is the problem. We lack sufficient evidence to know that the Wax's method is a sound methodology because the data set is pitifully small and it's inconsistent and there was no blind testing.
especially when you're dealing with something as rare and as precious as the Shroud of Turin.
And that's a red herring. You don't need more than one Shroud of Turin. What you need is plenty of normal linen samples to test to see if the wax's method works. There are plenty of samples of linen that have survived, enough that the author's small sample size is inexcusable. This is really a simple process. Prove waxes works with a large sample size and blind testing, then test the shroud. If they could show that the former works, they might be able to show that the latter dates to when they say it does. But they didn't establish the former. They just asserted the results. And assertions are not evidence.
What do you guys think? Do you think the quality of the samples used in the study is more important than the quantity? Or does the small number still kind of make you skeptical? Let me know in the comments.
Appeal to common knowledge ad populum.
All right, let's now talk about Falk's critique about the lack of blind sampling in the 2022 study. Blind sampling is often considered the sort of gold standard in scientific research because it helps eliminate bias and ensures objective data, at least to a degree. However, when it comes to something as rare and ancient as the Shroud of Turin, things aren't always that straightforward.
Bertuzzi doesn't understand our objection, and his appeal here to the preciousness of the shroud is misplaced. Our critique about blind sampling had nothing to do with the 2022 study, but was a criticism of the 2019 study. The problem is not that there wasn't a blind sample for the Turin test in 2022, but the lack of blind sampling used to validate the wax's method in 2019. Whether the 2022 survey is blind sampled is neither here nor there for me, although the survey could benefit from that. But the fact that the 2019 results were not blind sampled invalidates the entire process. It's like building a house on a bad foundation. If the foundation is bad, the house falls apart. The 2019 survey is the foundation. The 2022 survey is the house. Bad foundation, broken house. That's why we are very, very concerned about the lack of blind sampling in the 2019 waxes method, because it leads to a bad foundation.
Researchers were working with incredibly limited and precious material, and their top priority was preserving the shroud's integrity while still getting meaningful data.
And that is completely irrelevant to the validation of the waxes method. You don't need the shroud to validate the waxes method. In fact, you're better not to have it there. You don't need the shroud for that. You just need ordinary linen samples from a wide spectrum of historical contexts that are being blindly tested. That's what you need.
Like this, they had to rely on other controls and methods to keep bias in check. Interestingly, the researchers point out in their conclusion that the much smaller samples required for WAXS allow for repetitive measurements, which actually could be used for blinded future studies.
That's not how blind sampling works. Using the same samples in repetitive measurements is not a blind analysis. The researchers here are suggesting taking the samples they've already used and using them repetitively as a blind sample. No. With blind sampling, you take unknown samples that you have never seen before and don't know the dates and try to date them. Then some other independent group reveals to you the dates, or they are dated by some other method not done by you. The idea is that two independent groups are using different methods to date the samples, and then the results are compared and reconciled. This is done to validate to see that your method works and to work out the bugs in your method. The process simply was not done for the 2019 waxes method. So we have no idea if the waxes method actually works.
actually a significant limitation in earlier radiocarbon dating studies, where larger samples made blind testing difficult. So while the current study didn't use blind sampling, the researchers are already thinking ahead about how this method could be incorporated in future investigations.
This is scientifically irresponsible. You develop a general purpose dating method, have no idea if it works because you haven't done blind sampling, and then you make sweeping claims about the Shroud of Turin based upon it. The fact that they knew about blind sampling and are, quote, thinking ahead makes this so much worse. It means they knew about blind sampling and just ignored it and ran with the Shroud results. I can hardly believe what I'm hearing here. It's just... I mean, this is retraction worthy. This is really retraction worthy right here.
All right, let's now talk about the fire. Beyond these sort of methodological concerns, Falk points to a physical event that could have skewed the results, the infamous 16th century fire. Could this blaze have altered the shroud's perceived age, or are the study's findings still credible?
Okay, I want to point out something. I don't think the fire is as big a problem as the issue of bleaching. Just looking at the graph between sample A and sample B, we can see that bleaching can age a sample by about 500 years. The problem is that ancient people bleached their linen, and we have no way of telling if an ancient linen sample has been bleached or not. The matter of the fire is a distraction to the more serious concern over bleaching.
So we all know that heat and fire can mess with the chemical composition of materials, and it's crucial to think about how this might have affected the dating of something as significant as the Shroud of Turin. But here's the good news. The researchers didn't just sweep this under the rug. They knew that the fire could be a game changer, so they ran specific tests to see how high temperatures might have affected the linen fibers. But now Falk raises a very valid concern about the temperatures used in the study's fire simulations, noting that the tests were actually conducted at temperatures lower than the actual combustion point of linen, around 310 degrees Celsius.
Fire isn't at 200 degrees.
What is the temperature of most fires?
Okay, the combustion temperature of linen is 310 Celsius. So their tests are off by at least 100 degrees.
And it never caught fire.
They didn't actually burn their sample, and they didn't subject it to the temperatures that the Shroud of Turin would have been subjected to. We know because the Shroud of Turin caught on fire, that temperature had to be at least 310 degrees. I think this is really serious.
So then why did the researchers choose to expose the linen to only 200 degrees Celsius in their tests? The researchers defend their choice by pointing out that 200 degrees Celsius was actually the maximum temperature they could use while maintaining the same colorization found on the shroud. According to their findings, exposing the linen to higher temperatures would have actually altered the appearance of the fabric beyond what's observed on the shroud itself. Check out figure 20 in this paper by Giulio Fanti. Their testing showed that the linen could endure about 200 degrees Celsius for 30 minutes without getting darker than the shroud itself, which closely mirrors the conditions that might have affected the shroud during the 1532 fire or its previous history.
This is an interesting chart, and I want you to look at that, and I'll put a larger version up here on screen. I want you to look at the 150 degrees Celsius at 5 minute sample. Now, the paper this is from is Fanti's Optical Features of Flax Fibers Coming from the Turin Shroud from ATSI in 2014, Article 4, page 11. All right. Now, that paper doesn't say anything about the initial sample, other than it is a, quote, Turin Shroud-like fabric made by Leotex, Italy, end quote. And we notice here on the graph that the initial fabric is not shown in any photographs. These are all heated samples. None of them are the original. But the closest we're going to see to the original is 150 degrees for 5 minutes. Now, as I said, Fanti tells us nothing about the original fabric. Not even the Leotex product number. He doesn't even show us the uncooked sample. However, if you look closely at the sample, you'll see that it's a gray color. And this means it's probably linen that has been dyed. Natural linen, bleached or unbleached, doesn't look like that. The fact that Fanti doesn't tell us if the linen for these tests is bleached or unbleached, dyed or treated, throws all these results into question. We can't trust this fire sample because we don't know what it's based on. It's based on some random bolt of fabric from some factory, the Leotex factory, but we don't know what it is. Is it dyed, bleached, unbleached, treated in some way? Is it stain resistant? I mean, all of these treatments could affect the heating tests. So the fact we're not told is just more bad methodology upon bad methodology.
Previous history. It's also crucial to remember the details of that fire. The shroud was actually protected inside like a silver container when the fire broke out in the chapel. The intense heat melted part of the silver on the outside of the case, which then dripped onto the shroud, causing the burn marks in the holes. But the linen itself didn't combust from the ambient temperatures in the room. It was the molten silver that sort of dripped in and caused the damage.
That's worse, not better. Silver has a melting point of 962 degrees Celsius. And silver is a heat conductor, not an insulator. So the idea that the silver's protecting the shroud is dubious. Now, linen needs to be at 310 degrees Celsius to begin combusting. Whether the heat source is from the room or the melted silver is irrelevant to that. When the shroud started to combust, it had to have experienced that 310 degrees Celsius temperature for some period of time. But again, I don't think this is nearly as significant an issue as the bleaching problem.
Moreover, the piece of the shroud that was tested in the study was taken from a corner of the shroud, far from the areas that were directly affected by the molten silver. Given all of this context, the researchers might actually argue that their use of 200 degrees Celsius in testing was not only appropriate, but necessary to simulate the heat exposure that most of the shroud would have actually experienced.
Without a standardized linen-based sample for their heat tests, those tests are invalid. It could have experienced a lot higher temperature, and those color tests are just they're worthless. They're worthless because there's no null sample. There's no null hypothesis. You don't have a base sample to evaluate those heat tests.
So heat that was enough to cause superficial changes, but not enough to cause combustion. By choosing that exact temperature, they aimed to replicate the real conditions that could have affected the shroud during that fire without artificially aging the linen beyond what is observed today. So in short, while Dr. Falk is definitely correct that the test didn't replicate the highest temperatures of that 1532 fire, the researchers' methodology was carefully designed to reflect the actual conditions that the shroud would have endured.
And if Fanti had bothered to tell us what kind of linen he used, I might be more amenable to the idea that they carefully considered how much heat the shroud was subjected to. But again, they didn't. I'm just gobsmacked how the deeper we dig, the more sloppy and slack their methods appear. I just can't believe I'm hearing all this.
Take the fire, for example. They didn't just gloss over the fact that the shroud was damaged in a 16th century blaze. Instead, they ran specific tests to see how heat affected the linen fibers. And guess what? While the fire did cause some minor changes, it didn't mess with the natural aging of the cellulose.
Okay, I still think that the fire is a fantastic distraction from the problem that bleaching could have artificially aged the sample by 500 years. It also didn't escape my attention that the authors didn't mention the natural unbleached sample, sample B, in their 2022 paper. I guess that would have raised too many questions.
Then there's the blind sampling. It's true, blind sampling is the gold standard in research, and yes, it was definitely a missed opportunity here. The researchers could have used it to cut down on bias, and they didn't. That's definitely a limitation. But A, the authors acknowledge this, and B, the consistency of the results across the samples suggests that the findings are still very robust.
Okay, robust, huh? Yeah, he's using robust in a different way than I would use that word. Okay. We're going to stop the video there. Because he's just going to end the video with, calls to subscribe to his channel. After all of that, our conclusions remain unchanged. As we said at the beginning, if you want to believe the Shroud of Turin is the burial cloth of Christ, that's a faith proposition, and we're fine with you believing that. However, the Wax's papers assert claims that could open Christianity, Roman Catholicism, and the Bible to ridicule, and we don't want that to happen. Nothing Cameron has said has moved the needle. In fact, his response only makes the results of the 2019 and 2022 papers seem worse. The samples do not show a consistent pattern of degradation. The authors cherry-picked their data in a way that cannot be reproduced. The authors were aware that they needed blind sampling, but ignored that completely. And without blind sampling, we have no confidence that the Wax's method works. It is the pinnacle of scientific irresponsibility and demonstrates a pattern of confirmation bias that began long before their disastrous 2017 paper. So, anyway, I hope you found that interesting and you learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.